Welcome, everybody, to Boswell Book Company and Porchlight Book Company's joint virtual event series. I'm Daniel Golden from Boswell Book Company. Pass over to Sally Haldorson, the managing director of Porchlight Book Company. Welcome, Sally.
Welcome to everyone, and welcome to this next Porchlight and Boswell partnership. And we thank Boswell here in Milwaukee, Wisconsin for hosting this interview with us here at Porchlight. I'm Sally Haldorson, Managing Director at Porchlight, also in Milwaukee. Tonight, we welcome Batja Mesquita, a Dutch-born social psychologist, cultural psychologist, and affective scientist who studies the role of culture in emotions and of emotions in culture and society. I'm really excited to talk to you about your book, Between Us, How Cultures Create Emotions. Hello, Batja.
Hi, Sally. Thank you for having me here.
We have so much to talk about, and I want to highlight a few things before we get started. And I am curious, I know we talked earlier, if you're willing to read a little bit from your book. Excellent. So what we're looking forward to talking about today is the important distinctions you make about emotions, in particular, mine emotions that we feel individually and ours emotions that we experience in the space between us, and how those types of emotions are shaped by and valued by different cultures. And what I found most poignant about your work is that it enables us to access a level of empathy for one another in a way that we might otherwise ignore. And ironically, that empathy comes from not identifying similarities between people who live and grow up in different cultures, but learning the differences in our emotions and not expecting there to be similarities. So I have no doubt that by the end of this discussion, our audience will find that same gift of understanding, and we look forward to hearing a little from the book.
Okay. The first time I became aware that my emotions were not like those of people from another culture was when I moved to the United States. I was raised in the Netherlands and saved some short ventures to other European countries. That was where I had lived until I was about 30 years old. In many ways, my transition was easy. My English was conversational when I first came to the States because I used it professionally, and my American colleagues couldn't have been nicer. But I had difficulty making sense of others' emotions. And likewise, it was hard to gauge the state of my relationships. Did people like me? One time, I had new friends over for dinner. The meal was tasty and the conversation was engaged and at times intimate. We had fun. It seemed like this could be the beginning of a real friendship. That is, until my guest left and thanked me for dinner. I felt crushed because it had now dawned on me that we had failed to make a true connection. The way I was raised, where there's gratitude, thanking someone for dinner, there's no room for friendship. Thank you for dinner felt to me as an act of distancing rather than an expression of appreciation. I would have liked my guests to say that they were looking forward to spending more time with me, that they really liked the evening together, or that they felt happy or connected to me. Was this merely a difference in convention? Or were my emotions really different from the ones I experienced by the American people I encountered? Emotional differences at first seemed random to me, but over time, they gained meaning. I came to understand these emotional differences as serving divergent relationship goals. Pleasant emotions that would be appropriate in the Dutch context prioritize the connection between equals. At the end of a dinner party, or throughout actually, you would emphasize the connectedness between people, referring to the get-together as gezellig, a Dutch culture-specific emotion word. Derived from the old word for friend, gezel, gezellig describes both the physical circumstances, being snug in a warm and homely place surrounded by good friends, and an emotional state of feeling held and comfortable, stressing the connection is prioritized over acknowledging the host's efforts. In US contexts, by contrast, appropriate positive emotions often prioritize the articulation of unique efforts, talents, and contributions of another person. Friends and acquaintances contribute to each other's sense of value or self-esteem. In America, you praise and acknowledge each other whenever you can. This couldn't be more different from the Dutch context, where no one should feel or act any better than another person. No worse, but certainly no better either. My mom used to tell me that acting normal would be crazy enough, usually in response to me doing something that, in her eyes, caught too much attention. Nobody should stand out. When I asked my mom growing up if she considered me pretty, hoping she would say yes, I guess, she answered, "I think you're about average." She was telling me the truth, both grounding me and providing real connection between me and her.
I think it will be obvious for our audience why that's such an illuminating section from your book. And I wanted you to read it because I think it's very relatable. And we have all been in a circumstance where we've been to a dinner party and we've wanted to effusively thank the host for how much work they've put into the dish. Oh, you must have been slaving all day, right? And it wouldn't intuitively occur to us that that kind of compliment would be taken in any other way. And so when I first started reading your book and read that passage, it really illustrated this difference that you're trying to point out here between how different emotions are created by the culture, and then how maybe our expectations that everyone has a common response to situations is just that, an assumption. So if you would tell us a little bit about your motivation for writing this book, which I know stems out of your research, and talk a little bit about your specialty as an affective scientist and cultural psychologist, and how this book came to be.
Yeah, I think this book came to be in part because of the experiences I had. But what I say in the book is what is so striking about my experiences in America is that I had those experiences after I had studied cultural differences in emotions for 5 years for my PhD research. And it never, I described the other people's emotions that I studied as culturally different. But it never quite hit me that my own emotions weren't so much the standard, but that they actually were cultures as well. So that's definitely a part. But I think the more general point is actually one that you made earlier. I think many people think that emotions is what makes us human. And I think so too. I think emotions make us human. I think emotions tie us to the things that are important to us, to the relationship and the other people that are important to us. But they make us human without being universal. So I think my main motivation is actually to say, yes, we have shared humanity, all of us, by having emotions. But what those emotions look like can be very different depending on what is important to you in your culture, how you're used to doing emotions together, what kind of relational goals you have. And what I mean by that is exactly, are you connecting among equals, or are you praising each other and making each other feel good? Right. And it's good to recognize those. And I think I actually think it's teachable. Some of my American friends will now say, well, I would thank you for dinner, but I know you don't like that. And I say, no, you can thank me for dinner now that I know that.
But now I understand it.
Yeah, right. that it doesn't mean we are not friends. Right. So I think there is communication possible, but I do think that a lot of the assumptions we have in our daily life are actually fed by the experiences we have had and the ways that our that we have experienced emotions in the particular relationships that we grew up with.
Right. And I think even though when you're reading your book and the example that you gave in the piece that you read does speak to cultures globally,
Mhm.
I think there's so much, and I suppose my question would be, would you agree that the same principles or the same insight that you uncover about how our emotions exist between people can be applied, whether it's in the workplace or in the family or in a spousal relationship or a friendship, and how
Absolutely.
our environment is a culture.
Yes, absolutely. And when I say culture, I mean, I don't mean the national boundaries. I think culture for me are the experiences that you have with a group of people. And so cultures have been defined by national boundaries. I mean, that's certainly one by origin, by religion, by gender, by you can by cohorts sometimes, by age. So you can define culture in many, many ways. And there is no principled reason why it wouldn't also, why each family doesn't have a culture. I mean, it would be hard, I think, in research to show that there are differences. It's much easier to show the differences when you look at drastic or dramatically different cultures. But in principle, I think there are gender cultures, and in fact, I have an example in my book of a gender culture where I think I'm very female in a largely male environment.
Mm-hmm.
And there too, I think, I mean, I can tell the story if you want.
Yeah, I was going to say that's in one of my questions. So let's just go right there. And is this related to, I think it was, you call it an emotional ceiling that women often have? I don't know if this is the same, but we'll get there. Go ahead. Let's go with your story.
It could be. I remember now that I wrote that. I mean, the story was, I was the head, and I still am the head of one of the research groups in my department. And there was money to be divided. I mean, very brutally. And I thought we deserved to get some of the pie.
Right.
And they didn't give it to us. There was a proposal for a meeting with all the heads of these departments, and they didn't give it to us. And I started saying why we needed it. And I defended why we needed it. And I had all these arguments lined up. And then I started to cry.
Yes.
And as I was arguing, I mean, it wasn't that I wasn't defending my department, but I started crying. These are all my colleagues, all the other heads of the department. And people were clearly, I mean, when I say people, it was largely the heads of the department in Europe are still largely male. It was a male-dominated environment. People were really unhappy, and I know from the responses, they were kind of, they didn't really respond, but then afterwards, one of my colleagues said, well, you probably didn't remember last time what we discussed because you were crying. And actually, I want to say in between that, there is quite a bit of research that shows that for the core of emotional events, you have a much better memory than for everything else. So there's no real reason to think about that, except for this woman is crying, she's irrational. Yeah. And there was somebody who was overheard to say that this was a horrible meeting and that we should never do it again, and people were crying. And what I thought in retrospect is, it wasn't it didn't fit the culture. The culture was to fight. It wasn't what I say in the book is, it wasn't that nobody had emotions. Everybody had emotions, but the emotion was demanding better treatment. It was one of anger and indignation. And what I really did with my crying is I asked for help. I reached out and wanted connection, and I wanted people to help me. I mean, that's not what I thought at that moment, but when I rethought it, I thought, the relational goal here, and I think it's really good to think of emotions as relational goals and what you're doing in the relationship. And so what I was doing in the relationship was I was saying to my colleagues that I was feeling bad, and when I was probably expecting some compassion and some help. And anyway, I'm not, this is not, so what I say there, I do use emotional ceiling, because I think it's one of those small ways in which people misfit that can cost them. And I can say, you know, in my 15 years at that department, it hasn't cost me. It's one out of many stories that there are to tell. But I think that in intercultural relationships, that it often, and we see that it often costs people, and that it often feels as they're not smooth, they're not appropriate, they're not impressive enough, they're not convincing enough. I mean, I might not have convinced my colleagues because I didn't say, you know, I didn't state that this was what I needed and that they were wrong. So I think that really in our emotions, we weave the story, or we weave the fabric of our relationship in a certain way. And some of those ways are valued in certain contexts and some of them are not. And as you say, I think it's very important within a society to acknowledge those differences in how people weave their relationships and what emotions do, how they do it, and to not assume that your own way of doing it is the only right one, and that the only person who is respectable and to be taken seriously is somebody who does their emotions exactly like you.
Right. There was, just getting my notes here, because I made a comment toward the end about, you write on page 215 that there are no right and wrong emotions. There are only emotions that are right and wrong in a particular context by particular standards. And I asked the question to that, is one of the fundamental values in not assuming that everyone's emotions mean the same thing, the ability to apply that recognition to the behaviors and motivations of people in different cultures to create empathy, which is something I brought up earlier. But I think, and that this is in line with some of the other research and some of the other things that you're interested in terms of society, where we often apply our emotional standards to someone else living in another part of our city, or someone having a different family experience than us. Well, you must feel this way. Or when you say that you are frustrated or angry. And I think you spend a good amount of time talking about anger in the book, and using anger not only in gender, but also in different cultures, that anger is viewed in such a different way depending on the environment that you grow up in. And there are some people who are taught to be more free with their anger because they need to stand up for themselves. There are some people who, women in the workplace, might be told not to have anger because it shows a sort of hysteria or something, you know. And so I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about how we can use this knowledge that not everyone's emotional experience is the same, or our cultures create our experience, to inform what we know and what we assume about other really important topics in our society, like poverty.
That's a lot of questions at once, but let me
You can take it wherever you'd like to take it.
Let me start with anger. You know, I'm going to make it. I think, first of all, I want to reiterate what you say, is that, you know, what we think anger does isn't so in all cultures. So we just did this research. A student of mine did research on what Japanese couples and Belgian couples think about conflict. And she finds that Belgian couples basically think about anger and conflict, that it has a place in a relationship. It's actually, you know, it's unavoidable. you need to, it's helpful to make your needs known to your partner. You need to work it out, and each partner has their individual needs and desires, and of course they clash sometimes. And so anger there is a very instrumental emotion in the kinds of relationships that we want to have, where we value the individuality and autonomy of people and want partners to accommodate those. Japanese couples think anger is immature and needs to be avoided. And in fact, they think conflict is really a sign of not knowing how to conduct a relationship. They think that you need to avoid conflict. You need to read the air, is what they say. You need to be intentional about thinking what is good for the relationship, but also what the other person might want, and they accommodate the person more ahead of time and the relationship more ahead of time. So I don't think anger has the same value. And I'm trying to think, somebody who was telling me that their mom, I think a journalist actually, who was telling me that her mom, an Indian woman, said when she was angry that she was just immature, meaning that she didn't have the right to say what she wanted. I mean, well, as a daughter, she should just accommodate. So I think that is part of it. Another part of it is that we're still talking as if angry is a thing, right? But we don't actually, I don't think that we all have anger in the same way, and then it's valued in some cultures and it's not valued in other cultures, or valued in some environments, not in others. I think that the way we do our relationships, I mean, some of those ways we call anger. That's a complicated something, but what I know to be anger is the kinds of stories that are being told about anger in my culture. Is the anger that I have experienced? So is it anger that people responded to, or is it anger that people condemned? Is it anger that other people yielded to, that they gave me more power for? Or is it anger that other people avoided, looked away from, condemned, ignored? So I think that what we have as anger experiences is completely different in those different cultures. If you think of it as anger is a set of stories that we know, that we have experienced, then the interpersonal stories that are related to anger are very different. So what we expect when we see something, how much we're even inclined to see something as, this is unfair, I don't want you to do this, which anger I think is just different. And it's also different in what people get from it. So when you say, for women, it doesn't have the same effects, or it isn't, that's true. I mean, if you show a woman leader with an angry face, nothing happens. If you show a male leader with an angry face, then people think they have more power, and they should have more power. They're more competent. So we do see that those stories actually occur differently in different lives. Where was I going with this? Can you explain how anger, an emotion like anger, is different in different cultures? Yes, we also see it in child rearing. We see that cultures have very different responses to their children being angry, and even that the anger is sometimes condoned or even encouraged, and sometimes condemned, depending on the situation that it's in. So there's this Peggy Miller, developmental psychologist, who followed working class American moms in Baltimore. Mm-hmm. And she found that the moms actually thought their children should stand up against unfair treatment. So if somebody treated them unfair, they should be strong enough to defend themselves. But when those same kids got angry towards their mom, they were very dismayed. They thought that was a spoiled kid that they didn't tolerate. So the value in anger and how much it's encouraged may also depend on the specific relationship in which it takes place.
Mm-hmm. I think that all of that was really fascinating, and thank you for responding to my fire hose of questions. It's a really the concepts in your book are so interesting, and I think so applicable to how we process emotions and relationships and make that connection. And I want to sort of go back to something that I initially opened with, that I know is a key component of your book, which are the mine emotions and ours emotions, and sort of that being the fundamental distinction that you've been making. And if you can tell our audience about where you see that, and then how that works in relationships.
This is an interesting one. I think that our culture places, when we talk about emotions, we usually think about feelings that are inside us, that define our most private, that make us authentic. That's how we think about it, that are deep in a way. And, let me say right away that I was no different in assuming that when I started to study emotions, that I thought that if you wanted to understand people's emotions, that you should dig deep into them, whatever that means, in their mind, in their brain, in their bodies. And then I think two things happened. First of all, other cultures often do not talk about emotions that way. Other cultures often talk about emotions as things that happen between people. So an example that I mentioned in the book is Japanese had no idea when we tried to ask them, how intense are your feelings? They couldn't really answer that question. And, in retrospect, they couldn't answer that question because I asked them something about their deep feelings inside them. But they didn't think their feelings were inside them. They thought that emotions were between people, and that they were things that you conducted between people. So that's one way to say, is that different cultures really think about emotions as different creatures, so to say, different animals. So what I mentioned in the book is the movie Inside Out. I think the Pixar movie Inside Out is a movie that represents emotions exactly like we see them in Western cultures. They're inside the head. They're always the same, no matter how they come out. So the first thing to observe is that many cultures do not talk about emotions that way. And also, when you ask people what are emotions, or when you ask them to look at faces and say, what do you see? People often don't give feeling words. They give behavior words. They say crying or laughing instead of being happy and sad. So that's one thing to say. And that has real consequences. Your culture talking about emotions in those different terms has real consequences. So what I say in the book is the mine emotions are mental feelings. That's the M inside the body. That's I am. And then essentialist, by which I mean essences, by which I mean they're always the same things. Now contrast that with ours emotions, and that's the letters are scrambled, but it's outside the person. It's relational acts instead of mental feelings. Right. And then it's situational in the sense that they're always different depending on who is there, what happens in the situation, what the situation requires. So this is how a lot of cultures think about emotions. And we'll probably return to that, but thinking about emotions that way really has consequences for how your emotions are experienced or how they evolve. The other thing I want to say in the book is maybe we all have a little bit of mine and a little bit of ours. When I talk about emotions having relational goals, what I actually say is we feel things to weave the fabric of our relationships, right? We feel gratitude. As we feel gratitude, we really make important what the other person has done for us. Right. As we say gezellig, what we make important is that we're all together and that we have this connection and that is comfortable and held and probably snug and warm in the environment. So So I think we all also can look through the lens of ours at our emotions, and that some of our emotions, even the emotions that, even Westerners who often think about feelings, that we can learn something by taking this lens of ours and making it more important. What is this emotion doing between you and me? What is the relational act? What is my anger telling you, actually? What do I want to achieve in our relationship? And what is the anger in this specific situation? What does it want from me? How do I express it? So I think it's some people, I see some reviewers have understood me as saying they have our emotions, we have mine emotions.
Right.
I think we talk about our emotion mostly in terms of mine emotions. There are certainly cultures that talk about emotions mostly in our terms, but I think of it more as a way of thinking about emotions that can be foregrounded or backgrounded in the culture. And whether or not it's foregrounded has consequences. But I think we can all understand our emotions from what they do in a relationship, what kind of relationship we have, and what we want to achieve with them. And that's actually, I think, often a helpful way of looking at our emotions, even in Western cultures. So when I talk about me crying and asking for my colleagues to comfort me, you can say, a part of sadness is, I don't know what I'm doing here. Can you help me, please? Mm-hmm. And a part of anger is, I don't accept you, what you do. I want your demeanor to change. Mm-hmm. So I think that that it's helpful for us to see our emotions, not just through the lens of our direct relationship, but also through the lens of maybe our societal structures. When I have more of we talked about that, men and women, men have more entitlement still to be angry because it means demanding that the world accommodates to your wishes. So I think it's helpful to analyze those emotions from the point of view of ours, even if we also can see them as how they feel.
I think that I found it very eye-opening, and not from an in the sense that I am an American, and you do make a distinction in the book between some cultures and others in terms of countries and our experience and that kind of thing. But I think what was interesting to me in terms of my experience is that we get a lot of pop culture influence to, as you say, dig deep into ourselves, figure out what our emotions are. That we're told when we are trying to aspire to be better at something that another person's opinions or judgments or how you make them feel is their business. And I think there's a very common saying that I won't be able to say exactly, but it's something about, you can't be responsible for how someone else takes whatever it is you do, right? Like that's their business and this is my business. And this is transformative in the sense of, yes, I can go into a conversation with my friend or my husband and say, you made me feel this way, but whatever his emotion is when he hears me say that transforms into something else between us, right? So there is I think there's a transformational aspect of this that I think is really important for people. You're not isolated, you are part of that relationship or amongst that connection.
Yeah, I think we live in a culture that really I count myself to that, but I think we live in cultures that really emphasize the concerns and the interest of the individual. And that's a choice you can make as a culture and as an individual. but it's not the only way you can choose. And in fact, I think that we do more accommodating to each other than we realize. I think, you know, I don't just say what I want to my kids. You know, I protect their feelings. I don't just say what I want to my boss either. I don't just say what I want. I mean, I can, for sure I can, but is that necessarily better? I don't know. The culture makes it so sometimes, but it's not necessarily better. I see,
we have
a few chats. I know that Indigenous people think more collectively, and many people think more collectively. And I think, I think one of the dangerous aspects of these theories of emotions that tell you how emotions really are, they have to come out as an individual. I heard it. I'm in Toronto right now. I heard people on the street. I heard a 20-year-old girl say to another 20-year-old girl, "That's bad for you. If you suppress that stuff is going to get at you later."
Don't bottle it up.
And I think that is not necessarily true. We know from other cultures that it's not necessarily true. We know it actually in some of our research in Western cultures also. We know that if people count to 10, their anger has not necessarily escalated, it goes down. We also know from grief research from my colleague George Bonanno that people don't have to be sad all the time to get over their grief. They can actually connect with other people and have fun with other people. So the idea, of course, thinking that way will do something. And that's what we see. We do see that if people stick to their authentic individual feelings and then suppress them, that this comes at a cost. But that if people work towards seeing the situation in a different way, looking at the interest of other people, accommodating not in an involuntary, oppressive way, but just in also considering other people's concern or considering the concerns of the collective or the group. That doesn't have to, it's not the nature of emotions that has to hurt you individually. We know enough to know that that may be culturally true when you cultivate emotions in that way, but it doesn't have to be that way.
That's a wonderful distinction to highlight. This, like, you can choose.
Yeah. We choose, yeah. And I was talking to a psychologist friend yesterday about that. I think much of our therapy practices, and this is a can of worms, is actually very focused on our individual concerns. And that you could say, I mean, anytime that I have done some therapy, that the therapist has said to me, ignore what this other person, what effect it would have on this other person. Just do what feels good to you. And, as a 60-plus-year-old, I'm not sure that I did that in my youth. And now I think, yes, it's a way you can think of. It's sometimes liberating to think that way, but whether it's always good for the connections that you want to cultivate for the families, for the relationships, for the collectives, is a very different question. And so my sense is that even psychotherapy, many kinds of psychotherapy, not all of them, are less interested in the system and in emotions of the system than they are in the emotions of the individual.
Right. And I think we often in therapy are given to feeling like worrying about other people's emotions is depleting or draining, right? And we have to charge our battery, when we may, going back to the dinner party situation, we actually may recharge our battery by making that connection. We have a number of questions, and we're going to take those in just one moment. I want to ask one more question of you that I have on my list, just because I think that our audience will be very interested in knowing that you address this in the book, and that is the role of child rearing, I guess, raising a child and how we raise our children to experience emotions or to adapt their emotions to the cultural framework that they are growing up in. And I'm just wondering if you could say a few words about that, and then we'll get to a couple questions here.
Yeah, I think it connects to some of the things we've talked about earlier, that I start the chapter on child rearing with an example of me and my children's father, how we tried to make them feel good about themselves. And, you know, my son did something, it was really stupid, but when you gave him a book turnaround, he knew how to hold it back, the right side up. So we gave it to him twisted, and then he turned it up, and we were in awe, and all our visitors were in awe, and we created and recreated that situation. And it's just an example, of course, but we have all these practices where we make our kids feel good. And American, especially middle-class parents, will tell you that children should feel special and they should feel good about themselves and have self-esteem. Well, that is not a universal goal. And the same as we talked about the relational goals that make what emotion you cultivate and how it gets received. I think we're creating situations where our kids creating situations and emphasizing the emotions that we think make our kids into good kids. And in some cultures, that is knowing shame. Chinese mothers from Taiwan said that their worst fear was a child without shame. They didn't have a good word for self-esteem or for feeling good about themselves. What they said is a child without fear, that's a child that's up to no good. They can, you know, they can't deal with frustrations. They're just very self-centered. So a child needs to feel shame, because shame will, a shameful child knows their proper place in the hierarchy. There are also cultures where it's really important that children are properly afraid of elderly people and of the spirits. And actually, if you think that's a weird idea, then the 19th century Americans were still to a large extent focused on having, instilling the appropriate fear in their children, the fear of God. So I think, again, emotions are not good in and by themselves, but they're good with regard to what you want to do in a society, what you want to do in a relationship. And child rearing practices, socialization of emotion is vastly different. And you know, and it's not necessarily bad when parents shame their kids. We have to accept that that it may be bad for some purposes. If you wanted to have a child who was full of self-esteem and very self-certain, then maybe shaming them is not the route. But if you wanted to have a child who is humble and knows their place in society, then shame might be the right emotion. So
it's a fascinating chapter. And as a parent, I certainly reflected on you know, some of those practices that we put in place for our children and what we support and how we shape them. Let's read it. Let's go to the questions here. And
also, I don't have access to the chat. I see that they're coming, but I can't read them. So
I'll read them to you. We have one early on from Rosa. What influence has your theory about non-universality, but cultural design of emotions have in conflict resolution? What influence does your theory have in conflict resolution?
Well, I think conflict resolution is not so different from any other kind of negotiation of relationships. Is you will need to figure out what is at stake for people. Now, I don't know it's scaled up, but I don't know, it's so different from, let's say, couple conflict, right? Where you need to see what other people think. The only thing that I can think of now that is maybe really different is that in some cultures, people will not move towards the conflict, but will expect you to read them, or will think in, when the culture is very homogenous and the norms are very clear, and maybe hard to open that up for discussion because people just know that that was wrong. Your anger was immature. So what consequences does it have? For sure that you can't be so sure that your way of conflict solving is the proper one for everybody. I think you cannot always know if there was a conflict, maybe.
I think that actually goes to Jennifer's question too, that she says, would this mean it's not exactly helpful to ask someone how they're feeling, and why is "how are you" so often used as a greeting? And I do think that there is, I thought about that in terms of the dinner party and in general with our discussion here, that if you are the person carrying this knowledge into a relationship or into a conflict where you know that there's the mine emotions and your emotions and you're trying to make that connection, how do you start that? And I know at the end of your book, you do offer some steps to learning how to do this. What would some of those steps be?
I mean, I don't think we can know each other's feelings, but I actually don't think we really do it within a culture either. I think that often what we do is we infer from circumstances what people feel. And when you're in the same, it works to some extent, because, so what I say in the book is, and I think that would work in conflict negotiation, and I think it would work in trying to find out what somebody feels. I think when there is an emotional episode or event, I think the number one question you have to ask is, what is at stake? Why is this important? Is this situation important? And if it is, why is it important? What is at stake exactly? And don't assume that you know that, because a mother who tries to shame her kid doesn't necessarily think that her kid is, or the kid who feels ashamed doesn't necessarily think that they're an awful kid. That's not in all cultures what it means. So I think the first thing you want to find out is, what is at stake here? What is this about? Is there a disappointed value? Is there something that people would love to have? What are they thinking of? The second thing that you can try to ask what kind of feeling people have, but what the emotion is anyway, not necessarily what they feel deep inside them, but what is going on, what is the emotion, what are they doing? You can observe. And then I think one of the things to try to figure out is that a good or a bad emotion? When I say those kids are ashamed, and I've seen developmental psychologists thinking that a kid who is ashamed of themselves, that's bad. That's connected with depression. Well, it turns out it's not connected with depression in some cultures. It's only connected with depression if it's a sign of not meeting the central goals of the culture, namely to have self-esteem and to feel good about yourself. So I think that's the second question, is what does this emotion mean exactly? Is that a good emotion to have? Is it a bad emotion to have? Is it the emotion that everybody had? What would you think of this person if they didn't have the emotion? So like the Chinese mothers who say, if my kids doesn't know shame, then that's their road to hell. That's not. So I think that's important to know. And then I think it's important to know what the social impact is, both in terms of what is this person going to do, but also in terms of, well, how are other people going to respond? So what does this mean in the social context? I call it the social context of reference, because I'm talking about some of my examples in my last chapter are school kids who are in school in majority white American schools, but actually have a different, or Western European schools, but actually have a different context of reference. So I'm talking about a Turkish boy who, when his Belgian teacher accuses him of having made a mess, he cast his eyes to the floor, and the teacher thinks, see, he did it. He did something wrong. She asked him, did you do that? And he says no, and he is embarrassed. And the teacher thinks, see, he was up to no good. And for him, it's a show of respect. So I think trying to figure out what it means and what it means socially, what it means to not have it, is important. Now, I think we can try, and my own experience, as I mentioned about friends at dinner party, is that you can open up about it, and that you can try to get it, even if it's not your emotion, that you can try to get what is at stake for somebody else. So my American friends know that when they say thank you, that could be associated by me with taking distance.
Yep.
So I think, I don't say it's an easy solution. On the other hand, I'm not sure, we talked about what is a culture. I'm not sure that it's so different from finding out anyway from other people why it's important. But you have less assumptions to go by.
Exactly.
You have less shared knowledge. You don't share maybe the language of the emotion words. You don't share the same environment. You don't share the same values, which is what you usually have in an interpersonal relationship within pretty much the same culture. But when I talk to my husband, I need to do some of those things as well, or talk to my kids, I need to do some of those things as well. So I think in a way, it's articulating the questions that you have to do anyway, with people who had different experiences and that come to the situation in a different way.
Right. There are so many things that we haven't gotten to, and we could open up a number of cans of worms. I'm going to do one more question here that we have from Christine. Is there any research on a child who grows up in an emotional culture and then as an adult begins to explore that childhood from a different emotional culture? So I don't know if that, I'm not sure how to put those pieces together, but it can go in a lot of different
So
ways.
I understand that, how we don't really know that much about biculturals. We have some anecdotic stories about kids who look back on different childhoods. We also have, I mean, the example of the Indian. We also have kids who grew up in their parents' culture, but also are exposed to a majority kind of to a new normative culture. We know something about them, but we don't know so much. And I get the question. Many kind of therapies are looking back on your childhood and trying to analyze what happened in your childhood that make you feel the way you do now. And so how would that happen if you in the meantime bridged or transitioned to another kind of culture? Mm-hmm. I don't think there's very much research on it. We know from linguistic literature that people are often still attached to their first culture. We also know that people can really become parts of two cultures, that they can do one culture in one context and another culture in another context. There's some research, not specifically on emotions, that shows that people can be more creative when they have different cultures, because they know different ways to see the culture. we also know that it's very different whether those cultures are compatible or not compatible, whether being a member of one culture is you get discriminated by the other culture. So if there's conflict between cultures one way or another, it's harder to reconcile them. But really your question, I think, specifically applies to psychotherapy, and I don't really know that. I see another comment on children of interracial relationships. I think, what I honestly think is that this way of thinking about emotions opens us up to asking all those different questions about emotions, that all those questions that are interesting and that weren't really on the table when we thought that really everybody, regardless of race, regardless of culture, had those same little characters or figurines in their head, the ones that the Pixar movie showed. So I think it opens us up to questions that I'm not able to answer all.
I think that's a very good place to conclude in just saying that this feels a bit like the tip of the iceberg, and in the sense of there's much more to be revealed once we accept, embrace, explore this knowledge that you bring to the table, that there is not one universal experience of emotions, and drawing assumptions or applying assumptions to your relationships with other people that there are is a bit of a minefield. And we can actually start exploring these in our own relationships, in our own workplace cultures, in our sort of greater experience in the world. And I really hope that all of the people who commented and chatted today and the people who attended pick up a copy of your book, read more about this. And it is really has sparked a wonderful conversation. I'm very thankful for your time.
Thank you. Can I say one thing? I think actually that I said it opens us up for questions, but of course it also opens us up for interaction, right? It's in a way, it's hopeful that we can, through our differences, communicate. So I think that by not assuming that everybody is feeling and having their feelings in exactly the same way, we can actually try to, if not converge, understand each other better.
Right. Yes. Wonderful.
Thank you all for coming. Please sign up for more of Sally's events. Please buy a copy. I just sent between us back in the chat. You can click on the link and you'll open on a Boswell purchase page. Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Batja Mesquita, and your continued work. We are all the better for it. So.
Well said.
Sally.
Thank you so much.
Daniel.
Good night.
Good night.